Good morning. Take your Bibles open to Mark chapter 6 this morning. Mark chapter 6. We'll begin reading in verse 30 when you get there. Mark 6:30. I want to talk a little bit this morning about optimists and pessimists. Ask you this question: what's the definition of a pessimist? A pessimist is a well-informed optimist. A pessimist and an optimist were in a bad situation. The pessimist said, things can't be worse. The optimist said, don't say can't. Yes, they can. The optimist watches a basketball game and thinks, you know, if these teams just work together, they could score so many more points. The Pulitzer Prize-winning author Thomas Friedman says, pessimists are usually right and optimists are usually wrong. But all the great changes that have been accomplished are by optimists. We have an expression that says, losers make excuses and winners make a way. Henry Ford said this another way. He said, if you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. Now, if you've had a chance to look in the Bible and see in Mark 6 what's going to be covered in these verses from 30 through verse 44, you find a very familiar passage. You know the story already. You know the miracle that's going to take place, but instead I'd like for you just a minute to separate yourself, not view it as a story, but to view this and insert yourself into the story. The situation is you and 11 co-workers are faced with the task of feeding at least 5,000 men, possibly double or triple that figure based on if any families were in attendance. And what you have to work with is maybe enough food for one family and possibly a shoestring budget. The only direction that you've been given is give them to eat. I got to tell you, in those circumstances, failure seems imminent and success seems improbable. Noted business and management guru Ferdinand Fornes, in his book, Coaching for Improved Work Performance, states 4 reasons why people fail. The first is they don't know what they're supposed to be doing. Well, that's clearly not the case in this situation. The disciples know what the task is. Jesus said, give you them to eat. They understand what the task is. Number 2, they don't know why they're doing it. Again, that's not a real problem here. We understand why the people need to eat, because they're hungry. The third reason that people fail is they don't know how to do the thing they're supposed to do. And that is a big problem in this situation. The disciples ask how. They try to figure out through human analysis how the problem can be solved, and they have no answers. The fourth reason people fail is they face obstacles beyond their control. I dare say that this particular situation, there were several factors beyond the disciples' control. And it's good that the factors were beyond the disciples' control, because that's when God can show up. That brings us to the subject of today's message that I've entitled, Serving God Under the Circumstances. Serving God under the circumstances. Let's have a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for this day and thank you for this opportunity to be in your house with your people, Lord, even if by Spirit. And I pray that you would be honored and glorified in what we look at today. I pray that you give me power as I preach. In Christ's name we pray, amen. You hear people often make the statement, hey, how are you doing? And the person will reply back, I'm doing okay under the circumstances. Well, immediately you realize that they have just negated the fact that they said they were doing okay. What they really mean is that I am coping with a less than ideal situation. I believe you would say that this is a less than ideal situation. we're going to find 5 factors that went into the disciples' circumstances here and see how they were supposed to serve God under those circumstances. And in many ways, we'll see how we're supposed to serve God under the circumstances. First of all, read with me in verse 30. And the apostles gathered themselves together unto Jesus and told him all things, both what they had done and what they had taught. And he said unto them, Come ye yourselves apart into a desert place and rest a while. For there were many coming and going, and they had no leisure so much as to eat. The first circumstance that I want to talk about, number 1, is the limited strength of the disciples. Limited strength. Jesus tells them there in verse 31, he tells them, first of all, to come apart. He tells them to rest a while. He says, separate yourselves, relax, get over here, and you need to rest a while. It is true that we only have a limited amount of strength, and as we grow older, that limited amount of strength decreases year by year. We only have a limited amount of strength, and we must use what we have wisely, knowing that where we do fall short, Christ will supply the rest of our need. Isaiah 40, verse 31 says this, But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. You notice that verse does not say, they that serve the Lord will never get tired. It says, they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. In other words, their strength will be depleted, but the Lord will renew their strength. John chapter 15, verse 5, Jesus tells his disciples, I am the vine, ye are the branches. He goes on to say, for without me, you can do nothing. Therefore, yes, we do have a limited strength. However, we're going to find out that we're not to depend solely on that strength. Number 2, the second circumstance we want to look at is found later on. We'll continue to read verse 32. And they departed into a desert place by ship privately. And the people saw them departing, and many knew him, and ran afoot thither out of all cities. And out went them, and came together unto him. And Jesus, when he came out, saw much people, and was moved with compassion toward them, because they were as sheep, not having a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. And when the day was now far spent, his disciples came unto him and said, This is a desert place, and now the time is far past. Send them away, that they may go into the country round about and into the villages. We not only have limited strength, we have limited time. We saw there at the beginning of verse 35, it says, When the day was now far spent. The disciples also acknowledged that as they said, the time is far past. In the parallel passage of the book of Luke, he says, when the day began to wear away. Not only do we have limited strength, we have limited time. We can view this in a couple of ways. We can view this in a prophetic sense. We can view it in an exasperated sense. We may say to ourselves, this world is too far gone. Our country is too far gone. Nobody responds to door-to-door visitation anymore. People aren't getting saved like they used to. Well, let me ask you this. Do you know that God is done with preaching? That God is done with the United States and the missionaries that come out of there? Do you know that for a fact? Or is He just finished with you as long as you have a defeatist attitude? I've heard many say this, and let me just say this to preface my thought. I've heard many good men, many godly men, make this next statement. And I want to say this with all due respect. That many times I think that the statement we're about to use is used not as a motivator, but as an excuse sometimes. I've heard preachers say, and I've probably said it myself, we're closer now than we've ever been to the Lord's return. On one hand, amen, that is correct. On the other hand, well, no duh, Sherlock. Of course we're closer to the Lord's return than we've ever been, because that's the way time works. The Lord's return is somewhere in the future, and as we progress from past to present to future, we will be nearing the Lord's return. Congratulations. That is exactly true. Too many use this as an excuse to do nothing. However, that runs counter to what the Bible has to say throughout, especially in the Gospels, throughout Jesus' parables. We think about the parables of the 10 virgins. We think about the parables of the wedding feast, the parable of the unjust steward. All of those are written for us, are recorded for us to be motivated toward service, to be prepared when the time comes, not to be able to hold up as an excuse. Well, you know, the Lord's rapture is coming very soon, so let's not do any planning for the future. Let's not put too much stock into this world. No. See, at the end of a race, people don't slow down unless they want to lose. I've watched even a video this week of someone running a race, and they thought they had the thing well in hand, and they let up in the last few meters, and someone blew past them, and they were completely bewildered. Why? Because you don't slow down at the end of a race. If the Lord's return is near, if it is at hand, and by the way, according to prophecy, it is imminent. It could occur at any time. Because of that, as we draw closer to it, we don't slow down. We give everything we've got. Maybe you say there's limited time, and you say that in respect of yourself. You may say, listen, I'm too old. I'm too old to go like I used to. I'm too old to surrender to missions. The Lord will use somebody younger. The Lord will, surely, He knows I don't have much time left. Well, let me just ask this question. Who controls how long you have left anyway? Who's in charge of that? You can use things, you can say the world is too far gone, the Lord's return is nearby. You could say the time of my departure is at hand in terms of I'm old and I'm getting ready to die. You could say all those things, but really deep down the question is, are you willing to put God first, or do you want to continue to keep yourself first? Is that the real issue? A me first attitude. It's true we have limited strength. We have limited time. The third thing I want you to see, we started reading in verse 35. It says, "This is a desert place, and now the time is far past. Send them away that they may go into the country round about and into the villages and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat." He answered and said unto them, "Give ye them to eat." And they said unto him, "Shall we go and buy 200 penny worth of bread and give them to eat?" He saith unto them, "How many loaves have ye? Go and see." And when they knew, they said, 5 and 2 fishes. Not only do we have limited strength and limited time, but many times our circumstances dictate that we have limited resources. The disciples pointed out 3 limits on their resources here. The first thing they said was, this is a desert place. They weren't in a fertile farming community. If you remember from your Old Testament teaching, it was commanded of the Israelites that as they harvested their field, that they were to leave the corners unharvested for the poor and for the stranger to be able to eat therein. If they had been in a location where there were some crops, they knew they could count on the corners of the field. Even though we don't have much, we can do like the poor, and we can go around and we can get corn, or we can get whatever type of thing is growing. And the people may be able to walk around and forage for themselves and be able to eat. But it's a desert place. They couldn't even count on anything growing. Another limited resource is found when you find the question in verse 37, "Shall we go and buy 200 penny worth of bread and give them to eat?" That question was not so much of one of, "Lord, is this what you want us to do?" Rather, we see the full intent of it when we look at John's passage. In John chapter 6, verse 9, we see Jesus promoting this thought to Philip. When he says, "Give you them to eat," Philip begins to calculate. He's the accountant of the group, possibly. Maybe a good mathematician. And he says, okay, let's see here. The exact quote of Philip's was, 200 penny worth is not sufficient for them, that everyone may take a little. Philip the accountant, Judas the treasurer. The figure 200 pennyworth is used in both places. No one is sure if that is just a round number, like we might say $1 million. I wouldn't do that for $1 million. Or if 200 pennyworth is what Judas, the treasurer, had let Philip know they had in the back. That 200 pennyworth, again, by pennyworth, don't think just of pennies. 200 pennies, $2, 2 pounds. We're talking about 200 days' wages. We're talking more than half of a year of income. We're not talking about a small amount. We're talking about something that would be a substantial figure. Take your net pay for a year and divide that in two. That should be a pretty decent figure. That may have been what they had in the back, or it may just be a round figure that they were saying, even this amount of money would not buy food for all these families. One, we don't have crops growing. Number two, we don't have that kind of cash. And so as we found there in verse 38, he says, how many loaves have you here? Go and see. They accounted. We have 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Matthew 14, verse 17, they use the word, and they say unto him, we have here but 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Luke chapter 9, verse 13, the parallel passage, says this, but he said unto them, give you them to eat. And they said, we have no more but 5 loaves and 2 fishes, except we should go and buy meat for all this people. In John chapter 6, it says, there is a lad here which hath 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes. But what are they among so many? In each case, the answer that they gave back minimized the amount of food they have with but, no more than. What are they among so many? Limited resources. I do want to ask you this. Who are we to say what God can or cannot use? How are we going to say, I only have this small amount to give. Therefore, since it's so minute, I won't give anything. I won't do anything. That's foolish. That's wrong, because I want to tell you this. Give what you have to God, and He will make the most of it. Hold on to it, and you'll make a mess of it. Give it to God, He'll make the most of it. Hold on to it, you'll make a mess of it. Limited strength, limited time, limited resources. Next, we look at verse 39. We see the next circumstance the disciples were under. He commanded them to make all sit down by companies upon the green grass. And they sat down in ranks by hundreds and by 50s. And when he had taken the 5 loaves and 2 fishes, he looked up to heaven and blessed and brake the loaves and gave them to his disciples to set before them. And the 2 fishes divided he among them all. And they did all eat and were filled. How many were involved in service here? You know the answer to that. How many traveled with Jesus? In this case, it mentions in verse 30 that these were the apostles that were with him, that it was unlikely that Jesus had the 70 disciples, but instead that this was just 12 who were doing this distribution work. Not only do you have limited strength, limited time, limited resources, but also limited helpers. Not just a little food, but just a little help. 12 to feed 5,000 men? Man, it's going to take all day. Even if we did have the food, this is going to take all day. This is going to take a long time. The day's already passed. It's getting late. It's getting dark. How are we going to get this done? Matthew 9, verses 37 and 38 say, Then said he unto his disciples, The harvest truly is plenteous, but the laborers are few. Pray ye therefore the Lord of the harvest, that he will send forth laborers into his harvest. Lord, there's only 12 of us. Maybe we should just pack it up and call it a day. There's just 2 of us going out in EMT. Lord, there's not very many. Maybe we should just cancel. Sometimes there are limited helpers. But this is why God has called us to go. When we think of the Great Commission, it says, "Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature." It doesn't say, "Go if you have a large party. Go if the workforce is sufficient." He says, "Go." He doesn't say stay, he says, "Go." Look at verse 43. We stopped reading in 42. "And they took up 12 baskets full of the fragments and of the fishes. And they that did eat of the loaves were about 5,000 men." How many helpers were there? How many food distributors were there? There were 12. How many baskets of food were left over? 12. One for each disciple as a visible display of God's abundant provision and power. What if there had been 100 workers? Would there be 100 baskets left over? Quite possibly. But I want to ask this. But what if there were 0 workers? What if there were 0? Then you don't have 5,000 fed, and you also don't have any leftover baskets. God could not show His power through 0. We think to an Old Testament situation, Jonathan and his armor bearer are up against a garrison of Philistines. It's only the 2 of them. And this was quite the brave move when Jonathan says, "Let us go over unto the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for there is no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few." We think of Gideon reducing his army, or God reducing Gideon's army purposefully to take it all the way down to 300 men. And in any realm of possibility, those 300 men could not defeat an army that outnumbered them 100 times over. Through no stretch of the imagination would that be possible with man. But we serve a God who can do the impossible. And that brings me to my 5th circumstance. Yes, the disciples had limited strength, limited time, limited resources, even limited helpers. But the 5th thing that they had was an unlimited God. Verse 41, "He took the 5 loaves, 2 fishes, looked up to heaven." You know, when they tell you to keep your head up, it doesn't just mean don't look down. It doesn't just mean look horizontally. You should look up to heaven as Christ did. "He blessed and brake the loaves, gave them to the disciples. They did all eat and were filled with leftovers." Philippians chapter 1 verse 6 says, "Being confident of this very thing, that He which hath begun a good work in you will perform it unto the day of Jesus Christ." Philippians 2:13 says, "For it is God which worketh in you both to will and to do of His good pleasure." 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 verse 24 says, "Faithful is He that calleth you, who also will do it." Who's doing the doing in that verse? The one who called you. Not you, the one who called you. The one who commissioned you, the one who gave you the command is the one who will do it. 1 Corinthians 3 verses 5 through 7 say this. Paul writes, "Who then is Paul and who is Apollos? But ministers by whom you believed, even as the Lord gave to every man. I have planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. So then neither is he that planteth anything, neither he that watereth, but God that giveth the increase." The junior Sunday school teacher told her 8 eager 10-year-olds a story about missions. And she asked each of them, would you give $1 million to the missionaries? Yes, they all screamed. Would you give $1,000 to the missionaries? They shouted again, yes. Would you give $100 to the missionaries? Again, they all replied, oh, yes, we would. Would you give just $1 to the missionaries? She asked. The boys exclaimed, yes, just as before, except for little Johnny. Johnny, the teacher, inquired as she noticed the boy with his hands in his pockets. Why didn't you say yes this time? Well, because I have $1. Do we give God the same lip service? Lord, I'll give you everything and anything. If I were a millionaire, I'd give you $1 million. If I had a fortune, I'd give you the whole thing. But maybe He's only asking you for $1 or for $10 or for an hour a week. He's asking you to supply what you do have, not what you don't. We can say, I would serve God except for, and we use these items we looked at earlier, where the disciples were limited. We could say, I have no energy, I have no time, I have no resources, I have no help. And these are common objections that are still being recycled today. But this is my question. If you had more energy, more time, more resources, would you really be more faithful? I hate to tell you that you would only give the same proportion to God as what you give right now. Boy, when I retire, I'll have all this time that I can give to God. I'll have my whole waking hours. I'll have my whole day. You'll give your whole day to God? Tell me what you do with your free time right now. Oh, well, I don't have much free time. I've only got 6 hours a week free time. How much of those 6 hours do you give to God? That percentage will tell me how much you would give to God if you had the whole day free. The problem is not energy, time, resources, or who else is willing to help. The problem is your priorities. The problem is your heart. Psalm 51 verse 10 says this, create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. What spirit do we need? The spirit we need is the one that will say, God, I only have 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And what is that among so many? Lord, with the small resources that I have, I can't make a very big impact for you. And God says, why don't you hand it to me and let me multiply it? 200 pennyworth, I don't have that to spare. Jesus says, I don't need any pennies. I just need someone who is willing to give everything they had. The young boy who brought his lunch to Jesus. The disciples who put in their time and energy to distribute. Even in a desert place, even in a field where the labor may not be recognized, may not even be appreciated, with just a few helpers, a handful of people had the right priorities, and it made all the difference. It went into an account that is recorded in all 4 Gospels. And many the world over have read about this, have been blessed by it, and have been inspired to service. Have you been inspired to service? Are you willing to give your limited strength, time, resources, and help to God? Only you can answer that. I beg of you, like Paul in Romans 12, to give yourselves as a living sacrifice to God. Would you do that today?